They were filming hell. What they found would change them forever. West bank of the Elbe, April 1945. At Schöneck, near Magdeburg, engineers built a temporary bridge. Named for America's new president, Harry S. Truman. They also called it the gateway to Berlin. But the GIs weren't marching that way. The other side of the river marked the start of Soviet territory. Stalin's troops were already fighting street by street in Hitler's capital. So, Hollywood director George Stevens and his team had to forget about filming in Berlin. After the Torgau celebrations, Stevens got new orders. He was to head south, where the 99th Infantry Division was about to liberate Dachau. It would be his worst war experience. Dachau taught me about life. Since D-Day, George Stevens had followed American troops across Europe. He'd seen Paris liberated and the Wehrmacht defeated. Stevens had 16mm color film in his kit, which gave his footage a powerful realism. As an experienced Hollywood director, Stevens knew the power of images. April 26, 1945. American tanks advanced east of Nuremberg. Over the last few days, the GIs had been fighting fanatical Nazis again. It wasn't clear if Hitler had really left Berlin as announced, hiding in his Alpine fortress. At this time, camera teams from Special Film Project 186 were working in Nuremberg. They too were using 16mm color film. Their mission was to document the US Air Force's success against Nazi Germany. Hitler ordered the city of the Nazi rallies to be defended to the last man. But on April 20, Nuremberg finally fell. Its people looked to a new era of American occupation. But their trauma was unforgettable. To make things hard for the Americans, the Germans blew up all the bridges. But within days, engineers built temporary bridges to supply the troops. Fierce fighting occurred even in the suburbs, but the city center was chaotic. On April 12, 1945, journalist Franz Nadler wrote in his diary, "Nuremberg is dead. No light, no electricity. No gas, barely any water. Untold misery, unspeakable hardship. So many are sick or dying. But there are few doctors. No coffins, no hearses." An automatic camera filmed Nuremberg from the air. Allied bombing caused massive destruction. Around 90% of the city was in ruins. Over 8,000 people were killed. Days of urban warfare worsened the city center's situation. Historic buildings, spared for months, had now collapsed. April 26, 1945. A boy in short trousers stood out by the old city wall. Like many youngsters, 12-year-old Friedrich Erhard searched the rubble. He and 4 friends posed for the US Air Force cameraman. The victors' rules were announced across the city by microphone. A curfew was imposed from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m. During this time, no one could leave home without permission. Military police were ordered to shoot anyone without a permit or trying to hide. Escape. The U.S. military journal Stars and Stripes stated clearly, "The Americans didn't come to Germany to pat child murderers and nurse SS criminals." Following non-fraternization rules, GIs were forbidden to contact Germans. Nuremberg's infrastructure had totally collapsed. The daily fight for survival was for food and water. The Red Cross set up a water point by the city wall. Formed orderly lines with their buckets. 10 days earlier, there was chaos and looting. Fritz's diary said the area had become one vast, shoddy store. Those with only minor wounds were lucky. Just days ago, this Air Force soldier had been a bitter enemy of the Americans. The Special Film Project 186 camera team filmed the former Imperial City sites. Due to bombing risk at war's start, the beautiful 14th-century fountain was bricked up. On April 20, 1945, Americans gave the Gauleiter an ultimatum. But the fanatical Nazi wouldn't surrender on Hitler's 56th birthday. No surrender, was his blunt reply. Consequently, the slaughter in Nuremberg streets continued until evening. The district leader was eventually found dead. During 5 days of urban warfare in Nuremberg, about 400 soldiers and militia died. 371 civilians also lost their lives. An eyewitness described the desperation during Nuremberg's siege. In bunkers and cellars, people sat huddled, pale, sick, passive. Exhausted, they just watched the stretchers of the wounded. Now people look to the future, let the past be. But the victors wouldn't forget Nuremberg's role for the Nazis. On April 21, 1945, the U.S. Air Force camera team also filmed at the old Nazi rally site. Here, where Adolf Hitler once gave his fiery speeches. GIS enjoyed entertainment from jazz musicians and artists. Soon, many Germans would also feel this sense of being alive. Swing instead of military music, the final defeat of the Nazis' deadly ideology. On April 27, 1945, a camera team from Special Film Project 186 accompanied a reconnaissance unit through Franconia. The soldiers sought a site for a new U.S. Air Force airfield. They eventually reached a former Luftwaffe airfield that had been destroyed. To make the footage dramatic, the men set fire to the wreck again. Little was left of the hangars too. Here too, fresh flames were thought to make the scene more dramatic. It's unknown if the unit chose this site for a new U.S. airfield. Even Franconia's villages show signs of the final fighting. Here, a tank barrier has been cleared. White flags signaling surrender. Here, a GI interrogates surrendering Germans. With few Wehrmacht troops left. Old men and children were meant to defend their villages. A mixed group deployed as a last resort. Even the chief of staff of the notorious SS Army Corps, which fought hard in Franconia in early April, later admitted that due to American superiority and our total exhaustion, we could barely offer serious. Here too, 2 German prisoners of war are held in basic camps without shelter. Also here, 2 German POWs are in temporary camps with no shelter. The cameraman's notes don't say why civilians were interned. They'd likely drawn suspicion or were Nazi Party members. Americans still feared partisan attacks by troops in civilian clothes. The werewolves, as they were called, who attacked occupied areas. Prisoners in uniform had to be treated by the Hague Convention. One rule meant POWs could write to their families. But in the weeks and months that followed, the US military found it impossible to deliver letters in a destroyed Germany. So for ages, wives, parents, and siblings had no clue if their husbands, fathers, sons, or brothers had survived the war. In late April, a film team with Special Film Project 186 reached Plauen. Plauen had been a Nazi stronghold from early on. This is where the Hitler Youth Movement's forerunner began, the group that systematically filled young Germans with hate and fanatical militarism. An entire generation absorbed Nazi ideology at home, school, and in youth groups. At home, at school, and in youth groups. Years of brainwashing didn't vanish overnight. In late February 1945, Plauen was a main target for British and American bombers. When the US Air Force filmed in Plauen, about 80% of the town center was in ruins. Over 2,300 people died in the bombing raids. The survivors slowly started rebuilding their town. Anything useful was salvaged from the rubble. The cameraman filmed the ruins of this building carefully, the only part intact. showing a relief of Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who in the late 19th century had unified Germany. Now, unification seemed lost forever. The cameraman also took the first color photos of the rubble women, as they were known. Women hired by the American occupying forces to clear debris. All women aged 15 to 50 had to report for duty. They were paid with better food rations. In the middle of this desolation, a photo symbolized hope for a brighter future. It showed a U.S. soldier in Poland giving a small boy chocolate. In spring 1945, Germany was nearly defenseless against Allied bombing. Even anti-aircraft guns, usually outside towns, had little effect. In late April, the U.S. Air Force cameraman filmed an anti-aircraft gun site in an already occupied part of Germany. As early as 1943, boys born between 1926 and 1928 manned anti-aircraft batteries. By 1945, all fit men aged 16 and older had to fight at the front. So in the war's final stages, even 15-year-olds were used as Air Force helpers, as they were called. April 30, 1945. Here, American M4 Sherman tanks are positioned in Bavaria and are shelling a village. These photos seem staged for the cameraman, as U.S. forces faced little resistance by then. The burning buildings were likely just practice targets. On April 30, 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz learned that in his will, Adolf Hitler named him President of the Reich and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. What Donitz didn't know was that Hitler and his new wife, Eva Braun, had already killed themselves in the bunker under the Reich Chancellery. Donitz sent Hitler a telegram of loyalty, showing the Nazi leadership's complete delusion. "My Führer, my loyalty to you is unconditional. I will therefore continue to try to relieve you in Berlin. But if fate forces me to lead the Reich, as your appointed successor, I will see this war through, as the unique heroic struggle of the German people demands." The American tanks moved slowly in tough terrain. Their target was the Alpine fortress. General Eisenhower still feared the enemy's leaders had fled to Upper Bavaria and were holed up in the mountains. If the Germans established this fortress, they could force us into a long guerrilla war. On April 24, 1945, 6 days before Hitler's suicide, U.S. General Omar Bradley gave a bleak report. He told a parliamentary delegation from Washington, the war against Germany could last another year. GIs repeatedly had to clear tank barriers built by villagers. The terrain wasn't suitable for heavy weapons. Narrow mountain roads and bridges made progress difficult. Here, the Americans' numerical advantage meant little. While the Red Army battled fiercely in Berlin, U.S. elite troops advanced along quiet mountain roads and through pretty alpine villages, looking for German bunkers and fortifications. A view of Dachau concentration camp near Munich. Built in 1933, it was the first concentration camp in Germany. For 12 years, inmates were tormented, tortured, and murdered here. On April 30, 1945, George Stevens and his team entered the camp. They found a train full of bodies, victims of the death marches, as they were known. Concentration camp inmates who starved, froze, or were shot on their journeys across Germany. Stevens later wrote, "It was like walking through Dante's vision of hell." U.S. troops had reached the camp north of Munich the day before and freed over 30,000 prisoners. On April 30, 1945, a survivor, Edgar Kupfer-Kobowitz, wrote in his diary, "American soldiers come into the camp to look at us. A group of them went to a block In the washroom lay the corpses of 50 inmates who had died of starvation or exhaustion. When an officer saw the bodies, he wept. It's strange to think that a man in battle, seeing many corpses, an officer in war, would cry at the sight of our dead. But I know what our dead look like. The sight is so shocking that even a warrior's tears are understandable. Some GIs reacted with uncontrollable anger and shot about 50 guards. Most perpetrators were arrested, though. George Stevens' team filmed the SS guards, who now claimed they were just low-level subordinates just following orders. How scared the inmates were is shown in Dutch resistance fighter Nico Rost's diary. The day before liberation, Rost wrote, 6:30 a.m. The SS have raised a white flag. Are the Americans that close? The SS have raised a white flag. Are the Americans that close? Will the SS still here surrender the camp without a fight, or kill us first? I don't even trust the SS's white flag. Why are they still threatening us with their machine guns? No, the SS will always be the SS, until they are destroyed. Guards who disguised themselves as inmates at the last moment were identified by real camp inmates. SS members could also be identified by the tattoos on their arms, showing their blood group. This man was genuinely an inmate. The number tattooed on his lower arm proves it. George Stevens and his team spent a few days in Dachau to document the conditions and the camp as accurately as possible. A major problem in Dachau was the risk of an epidemic breaking out. Former inmates helped with the delousing. To feed the survivors, the Americans brought bread to Dachau from their army supplies. But even after liberation, many inmates still died from their suffering. American journalist Martha Gellhorn was in Dachau when, on May 8, 1945, a Polish doctor told her Germany had surrendered unconditionally. I was in Dachau when the German army surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. We sat in that room, that cursed prison cemetery, and no one had anything more to say. Still, Dachau seemed the most fitting place in Europe to hear the news of victory. For surely this war was meant to abolish Dachau, and all places like Dachau, and all that Dachau represented, and abolish it forever. A flight over Munich, the capital of the Nazi movement. Here, World War II ended on April 30, 1945, the day Adolf Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. US troops occupying the Bavarian capital met little resistance. Munich had also suffered heavily from British and American bombing. A team from Special Film Project 186 used an automatic camera to gauge the extent of the damage. One Air Force cameraman in Munich was more interested in its political past than city living conditions. Before the war, Hitler had staged grand parades on the Königsplatz. Whenever he was in Munich, he stayed at the Führerbau, the Führer's building. Party bigwigs had tried to protect it with camouflage netting. The Prince Karl Palais. Until 1933, the deserted official residence of Bavarian presidents. Under the codename Pheasant Hunt, patriotic forces had called for resistance against the Nazis. But only a few of Munich's citizens responded. Even with Americans at Munich's gates. Hitler's governor of Bavaria refused support for the movement, which was brutally crushed. In the end, Munich was taken without a fight. The House of Art was also still covered with camouflage netting. It was in the Palace of Justice in 1944 that White Rose members were sentenced to death. Led by Hans Scholl and his sister Sophie, the group had distributed flyers urging people to reject the Nazi regime. The Braunhaus, the Nazi HQ in Munich, was totally destroyed in a bombing raid. It was at the Feldherrenhall in 1923 that Hitler's attempted putsch failed. On May 2, 1945, Germans learned their Führer was dead. He had supposedly fallen in. Hitler's dead, and we all act like it doesn't concern us. Events had swept over him. The Third Reich vanished, like the Great War. Hitler's dead, and we all act like it doesn't concern us. Spectre, with swastikas on his Nazi flags. Herr Hitler, too, has ended up on the rubbish heap. Go to hell, Führer and Reich Chancellor. Past times. You don't interest us anymore. In negotiations with the Americans, Munich's Cardinal, Michael Faulhaber, tried to improve living conditions for the city's inhabitants. Looting was still a daily occurrence. But the occupying forces quickly stopped the chaos. Here too, people were glad the war was finally over. All that was left of the Hofbrauhaus was the facade. It was in this world-famous tavern that Adolf Hitler's career as a fiery orator began. GIs on guard at the Bürgerbräukeller. In November 1923, Hitler proclaimed the National Socialist Revolution here. Now the historic beer hall was used by the US Army as a canteen. While the cameraman with Special Film Project 186 filmed in Munich, George Stevens also arrived in the city. The Red Cross used the Maximilianeum as a military hospital. In 1949, Bavaria's democratically elected state parliament would move in here. The Hollywood director and his team recharged their batteries after the strain of the last few weeks. The indescribable horror of Dachau haunted George Stevens, and he welcomed a change. While people were still dying in the concentration camp north of Munich, in the city itself, inhabitants were already sunbathing by the river Isar again. Stevens and his team also visited Nazi regime holy sites, like the Brown House, now in ruins, and the Königsplatz, with the Temple of Honor, which held the ostentatious sarcophagi of those killed in the 1923 attempted putsch. Stevens didn't know that George Elser, who had tried to kill Hitler with a bomb in the Bürgerbräukeller, was murdered shortly before Dachau's liberation. From Munich, US Air Force camera teams drove south and west along Hitler's autobahns. Outer lanes. Near Augsburg, a cameraman found strange aircraft on the edge of the outer lanes. They had clearly been parked there to avoid enemy bombing. Now the wrecks were just scrap metal. And as wonder weapons, these Mi-262s were expected to change the war's course. These planes don't really look like conventional fighter aircraft. They look more like futuristic designs from science fiction films. The Mi-262 was the first jet fighter and, at the time, the world's fastest aircraft. Here the jet engines have apparently been dismantled. American special units probably took them somewhere safe for transport to the United States. Near Augsburg, a secret factory site used slave labor. It built the Mi-262 jet. A film crew, Special Film Project 186, reached Berchtesgaden. On May 4, 1945, the town surrendered without a fight. In a flyer to residents, District Chief Executive Theodor Jakob hoped that our women, children, and homeland would be spared great disaster. Still, the first days of US occupation saw assaults and rapes. But the US military finally controlled such acts. Berchtesgaden wasn't just any town in the Third Reich. Nearby was Hitler's secretive mountain retreat, the Obersalzberg. Now, it was just ruins. Because on April 25, 1945, the Führer's restricted zone had an unwelcome visitor. British bombers destroyed it, stopping it serving as a final refuge for the dictator and his circle. By then, Americans knew they'd been duped by propaganda, as General Bradley later admitted. The Alpine fortress was so exaggerated, I wonder how we were so stupid to believe it, he said. At the complex's heart was Hitler's Berghof, with its huge view window. Now, it was a tourist spot for GIs. Just before the Americans arrived, Berchtesgaden locals looted not only Hitler's retreat but also food-filled bunkers. In 1939, a road was cut for the Führer so the Kelstein house could be built on the summit. Snow meant the crew couldn't reach the top. The cameraman filmed locals instead. Hitler wasn't the only Nazi with a villa here, other top Nazis did too. Near Berchtesgaden, US troops found a freight train full of art. These valuable items belonged to Hermann Göring. Hitler's second-in-command had looted art from across Europe and kept it near Berlin. With the Red Army advancing, Göring had it all packed and moved south. But he couldn't collect his art because on April 23, 1945, Hitler removed Göring from all posts and had him arrested. The stolen art was seized by the Americans and returned to its owners. On May 5, 1945, a film crew reached Linz. The Wehrmacht had also surrendered here. The cameraman filmed German soldiers held at the historic Trinity Column. In Linz too, Nazism had vanished as if it never existed. But German and Austrian soldiers, who had eagerly followed Hitler for 6 years on his criminal path, were now facing the consequences. Linz was special to Adolf Hitler. The dictator went to school there and discovered Richard Wagner's music. His mother was also buried in Linz. In his bunker, Hitler visited a model of his Linz plans almost nightly. After victory, he planned to retire there with Eva Braun and his dog. But in May 1945, Linz residents wanted no part of that. What mattered was their new rulers. The city's last defenders were marched to POW camps. On May 5, 1945, the German Armed Forces commander, Admiral Karl Donitz, chose to stop fighting the British first. A secret document stated, "If we surrender in northwest Germany, Denmark, and Holland, it's because fighting the West is pointless. But the East must continue to save Germans from Bolshevism and enslavement. Through proud, dignified conduct, each soldier has upheld the German nation's honor. It remains pure and sacred. Even now, after a struggle of 6 heroic years, unmatched in world history." Naturally, it failed to mention the countless crimes committed or condoned by Wehrmacht soldiers. This cynical amnesia suited most German soldiers. On May 5, a German soldier near Görlitz wrote, "A ceasefire in the West. The end is near. Wild rumors are circulating. They say Americans will free and rearm prisoners to drive out Bolsheviks, because our homeland must be freed. Some still hope for a new offensive. But most troops want it over. Yet, everyone would fight if it meant joining Americans against Russians. Then the war's length wouldn't matter." Outside Linz, German POWs met Vlasov's army units. Since autumn 1944, about 100,000 Russian Liberation Army soldiers fought for Nazis against the Red Army, led by General. Their fate was much worse than their German comrades. As per Allied agreements at Yalta, Russians were returned to the Soviet Union. Those not executed faced at least 6 years in Siberia. On the evening of May 5, author Eric Kessner noted, "Depression turns to irritability. Everyone blames everyone else. Everyone excludes themselves from the blame. Why are people irritable? Because they are surprised. But how can they be surprised? Did they really believe the lies? To the USSR. Survivors were exiled to Siberia for at least 6 years." On the evening of the 5th of May 1945, Eric Kastner wrote in his diary, "The gloom is turning to irritation. Everyone's passing the buck. Everyone's pointing the finger at everyone else. And everyone's exempting just one person from this blame, themselves. Why are people so tetchy? Because they are taken aback. But how can they be surprised? Did they really fall for the lie? Did they genuinely mistake that mad talk for truth? You can't be that thick. You can only act it. Now they are acting surprised. So, they are playing the fool once more. They'd rather seem like a total numpty than a rotter.